Hello, welcome to a special edition of CropLife Retail Week. I'm Eric Sfiligoj, editor of CropLife and CropLife Iron, here with two guests this week, Jim Delisi from Fanwood Chemical and Jeff Pritchard from Westlink Ag. Gentlemen, welcome back to the program.
Nice to be here.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, so hey, wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on in the world, if you will, sort of current events. And I know we wanted to touch on this topic, how tariffs and trade volatility are reshaping the cost of doing business in ag retail, and more importantly, who pays and who's getting money out of this situation. So I'll start with you, Jim, because I know I had you on Retail Week not too many weeks ago, and we talked about the whole tariff refund situation. So if you could give us the latest on that situation, and then, how that is impacting ag retailers, if at all.
Well, the best number I can find is that $104 billion in refunds have been approved, and about $75 billion has been paid out. Of course, not a small percentage of that went for agrochemicals. Jeff can better talk about what his experience has been trying to pry refunds out of his suppliers. But the money is flowing. There's still no update. As we talked about last time, the administration has appealed the idea to issue refunds for imports that have liquidated, which would be about half of the number. So that's still working its way through the court system. Probably takes 6 months, a year, maybe longer for that to settle. But $104 billion has supposedly been sent back into the economy, with probably another 50-60 billion to go for entries that had not liquidated. And I'd be interested to hear from Jeff if he's having any success getting any refunds from the suppliers.
Good question, and probably the blunt answer to that is no. I think a lot of suppliers are still trying to reconcile, how they're able to apply that to a transactional level, like doing business with a company like mine. So we are talking to them about it and doing a little bit of our own tracking, but we haven't seen, to be honest with you, a lot of impact on pricing due to rebates or due to tariffs, Prices have stayed fairly low throughout the last 2 or 3 years on the ag chem front, at least on the generic side where we deal pretty exclusively. So it's hard for them to identify which of their sales are associated with a tariff increase if they had that on their cost. But with so much inventory in the market the last 2 to 3 years, prices have pretty much stayed compressed across the major high volume agrochemical, especially on the generic side.
Well, and that confirms that a lot of the tariff increases were eaten in the system. And because the other piece of this, of course, Eric, if you import an AI and you pay a tariff on it, by the time it gets formulated, diluted, packaged, shipped, the amount of the actual increase in the tariff is greatly diluted. Now, I would not say that would have been the case when the tariffs were well over 100% for a short period of time on China. That's a big hit. But when they're 20-25%, it gets diluted so far down the supply chain that it's sometimes it can be hard to find.
Okay, all right. Well, with all that in mind, again, what's going on with the global supply chain situation? I know, Jeff, you and I had you on a while back, and we talked about how the whole situation in Iran and Strait of Hormuz was affecting the fertilizer chain, supply chain. But what's going on with crop protection? Is it being impacted by any of this uncertainty as well? And how are your members at Westlink dealing with that?
It's an apropos date that we're dealing with here, July 15th, middle of the month, middle of the season. We're kind of regrouping and getting ready for 2027. A lot of the product has moved into the channel. It's been applied in the field. There's, I think, a lot of uncertainty at the retail level right now about where prices are going. We're just starting to get some fill programs thrown at us from our suppliers. Some of them are very aggressive in terms of the incentives they're providing. And I think that, more than anything else, I mentioned it earlier, inventory in the field. Some companies are driven more on cash flow than they are on profitability, and they want to move that inventory. And then there's a tremendous amount of behavioral pricing activity going on. And that's really hard to get a metrics around, because if I'm sitting with a supplier and I tell him product X, we can buy truckload volumes at say 1250 and they're priced at 13, they'll come down to 1250 immediately, or they'll run to a discounted price below that. So I think a lot of companies are trying to jump on 27 right away in early offer programs now, and in an effort to try to gain as much revenue as they can before whatever's going to happen happens in Q4, Q1 2027.
Okay. Eric, I would add two things to that. From the import side. The so-called 122 tariffs expire on July 24. That's 9 days. It was thought that the 301, so the new 301 investigation on forced labor would have a tariff rate that would kick in before the July 24th expiration of the 122. As of today, there are no conclusions to the 301 investigation on forced labor. There was a hearing a week or so ago, which they have not completely digested. And there are a whole bunch of countries that have come into Washington to say to USTR, we are not guilty of forced labor. And in fact, India has passed within the last couple of days legislation to ban the importation into India of products produced with forced labor, which is one of the key goals of the investigation. So if you said to me, what's the tariff situation going to be on July 25, 10 days from now, the answer is don't know. The other thing that's going to put an interesting monkey wrench in all of this is the glyphosate case. Yeah. And that will proceed. It'll probably take a year for it to finalize. But Bayer Crop Science is said to be going to declare circumstances that would permit 90-day retroactivity on the imposition of tariffs. We could theoretically be within that 90-day window before the end of this month, if everything hits schedule. So, and you can suspect that the tariffs on Chinese glyphosate are going to be significant. Whether they'll be as big as the tariffs on Chinese 2,4-D or not is unknown. A lot of it will depend upon how the investigation goes. Anybody that actually wants to participate or watch the investigation can go to the USITC website. There will be a public hearing on July 21, which I don't think it's Zoom. It's one of the other systems that they use. You can watch the hearing just to get an idea what's going on yourself.
Interesting. Jeff, any comment on that?
Yeah, first, we're seeing very limited activity from our suppliers now that supply us with glyphosate because they're waiting for this Bayer situation to play out. As well, though, we're not going to see a lot of movement with other products. And I truly feel that once this plays out, well, if Bayer succeeds, we're going to see probably a 2x increase in the prices we're paying today for glyphosate from the generic suppliers we deal with. But, excuse me, at the same time, we probably won't see a lot of movement on glyphosate, which is a very acceptable replacement to that. Yeah. And that, my company alone has over 20 suppliers of the same formulation of glyphosate in the marketplace, and that price has remained compressed. When we looked at some data earlier this summer, and we looked at some of the major ag chems that are off patent, like glyphosate, glufosinate, dicamba, 2,4-D, and then tack in there azoxystrobin, propiconazole, and a fungicide piece, and bifenthrin and lambda. On the insecticide side of it, we saw a decline of around 23% in terms of overall market value, which was all price, from say 2022, which was post-COVID when we had that price hike, after it waterfalled down, we've seen continued compression in that market. And so you're talking somewhere around $750 million of market cap that has basically disappeared off the market based on price decreases. And where are those margins, coming from? So at the retail level, there's a lot of day-to-day play on this. We're not looking out too far in advance because we don't need to. With prices as compressed as they are, we don't need to worry too much about, say, some accelerated position, with the exception of glyphosate brought about by Bayer's actions.
Interesting. Okay. Well, Jeff, you had mentioned about, some alternative products out in the marketplace, and I don't know if the timing on this was coincidental or not, but it seemed just after the Supreme Court rendered its decision regarding glyphosate case, I noticed EPA then approved a bunch of new active ingredients for use for the 2027 growing season, including one from Bayer, which I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head. Maybe Jim, you could help me on that one. But again, there's some new AIs coming into the marketplace. Are they going to help or hurt this situation that we've been talking about for crop protection products? What do you think?
Well, it depends on what they are, and I won't profess that I've followed that very closely in the last couple of weeks. I did hear about that, and I have to look into it. But I think that a lot of what we see, at least from the post-patent companies that we primarily deal with, is when some of these products come off patent, which makes them new on the generic front, like a prothioconazole, spirotetramat, products like that. The number of generic entrants is incredible and quick. In the case of like prothioconazole, within a year of it coming off patent, there were 10 new entrants in the marketplace. 7 or 8 of those we do business with. And what that's doing is that's causing a waterfalling in pricing. When you're talking about some of the new actives that are coming out, I probably won't see those for a couple of years in the case of a Westlink Ag. But the products that we have available to us today are obviously covering 99% of the fungal, insect, and weed issues we face in the United States market today. So we'll see how they fit in terms of maybe they provide better resistance management, or perhaps they provide better stability or easier to work with on a formulation front, mixing front. So that's soon to be. We'll learn that as we work with those newer products.
So, Jeff, I know I've done stories in the past 20, 30 years looking at the generic marketplace in the US versus, say, in Europe. And I know the numbers and percentages are always much, much smaller here than they are in the EU countries. So are you saying that some of the I guess, resistance or hesitancy that we've seen from ag retailers to having these products in their portfolios has changed over the last few years? And if so, what do you attribute that to?
You're talking about their resistance to generics over a branded
Correct.
MNC type product.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that resistance has been non-evident for at least 10 years, maybe longer. I think that there's a lot more comfortability with generic products today. I actually don't think it's an issue at all. I think more than anything else, it may be driven at the farm gate, where a farmer wants to use a brand because he may know the rep, or he may just identify better with having the brand, meaning the initial product. But in our case, we pretty much speak generic language all the time, 100%. And I don't see any kind of issue. A lot of these generic companies have to go through a tremendous amount of effort to get their registration, substantial similarity to the branded piece. There's not a quality issue. There's the occasional packaging problems, but we face that with branded products too. So no, I don't see any resistance at all to using generics. And obviously, Eric, you're on top of this better than I am, but the farm economy is most certainly driving that as well, because the cost of the generics are usually a much lower for an input-driven farmer than, say, the cost of the branded product.
Just going to add that the first significant quantities of peroxysulfone tech arrived on our shores in July from China.
Yep. And just since that went off patent, we have 5 generic entrants in the marketplace today, including, the registrant. So 4 generic entrants since it went off patent. And we're already receiving pricing intel on those products.
Well, tech is here now for formulation in the United States. Formulated products started arriving a couple of months ago.
Okay. All right. Well, gentlemen, as we try to wrap up here, then, again, I'm looking forward. I know, Jeff, you had mentioned about planning ahead, always a good strategy for any ag retailer, I know, but some advice for the ag retailers that may be listening to us talk today. What would you advise, maybe 2 or 3 steps they can take to safeguard their businesses as we move into the 2027 season when it comes to like input pricing and supply and demand, of course?
I think that they need to challenge their suppliers or have very constructive discussions with their suppliers about total supply in the market. They need to have a broad base of suppliers. Unlike what we face on the fertilizer front, on the ag chem front, we do have a very competitive marketplace with a lot of suppliers looking for market access. So I think the best move is to have as many, like say a glyphosate, if I talk about 20 suppliers, that's a good problem because we're able to look at each one of them fairly and make our decisions going forward. I think in general, with the exception of a few molecules, there is adequate supply in the market. So I don't know that there's a lot of pressure that we have to buy product now because we're going to run out of it later. Even though in some cases, like I get Jim's reports, imports are down on some molecules like glyphosate, but there was a lot of glyphosate in the country the last 2 or 3 years. So that has helped keep things compressed. So there's not an urgency to have to take a position. If you have an opportunity, early pay program or something like that comes to you, what we advise is we reach out to our other suppliers and see, where they are in terms of their supply and their aspirations for market access. So that would be my advice, at least going into the next couple of quarters. The other thing is that I think at the retail level, we really have to get to know our farmer customers even better than we did before. First off, the farmer has more access to this intel than he had in the past. So he's very intelligent about where prices are going just as much as our retailers are in a lot of cases. But also because of what we're seeing with commodity prices, we've had some fortunate weather. Looks like we've got pretty good crops across the board. So we're going to have good yields coming out of the fall. But if we don't see an improvement in, we've made it up to this point, now we're going into 2027. If we don't see an improvement in the farm economy, it behooves retailers to get to know their farmers better and understand where their financials are going forward, or we're going to get in a backwards scenario in that regard. And that's never good.
Yeah. Jim?
I would just add that to that excellent summary, there is a lot of geopolitical things that are going to impact this business, since the lion's share of molecules are either imported entirely or key components are imported. And so just to keep an eye on what's going on with international trade in the Trump administration, because obviously, which I said earlier, that we've got a big impact on July 24th, and we don't know what it is yet. So it's only 10 days away. So keep your eyes and ears open. Inventory is probably your friend, and just buckle up for kind of a roller coaster ride, especially if you're heavily involved in glyphosate.
All right. Well, and again, we haven't even touched on the whole U.S., Canada, Mexico trade agreement issue, because I know that's now going to be a ongoing basis kind of thing versus a long-term agreement, if I remember reading correctly about what's going on with that. So,
well, the administration has their position right now is they want it to be 2 bilaterals.
Right.
So just the U.S., Canada, U.S., Mexico. Canada and Mexico want to keep it a trilateral. It will take a while to figure out what's going on. Ambassador Greer is testifying to the Senate Finance Committee next week. We may learn something there.
All right. Well, very good. Well, obviously, we'll have you gentlemen back on again as things develop in the marketplace. But it certainly sounds like, based on what we've been talking about, there'll be a lot to be following and paying attention to as we move forward here into the planning stages for next year. So, Jim and Jeff, thank you so much for joining us for this edition of CropLife Retail Week. We appreciate your insights. Viewers, we hope you enjoyed this edition, and we will see you again next week. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Eric.
Eric.